Hey guys, tonight we're pulling back the velvet curtain on one of history's most uncomfortable truths, the medieval wedding night. Picture this. You're a 15-year-old girl in 12th century England, draped in scratchy wool, your face stiff from a forced smile. The feast drags on, but your stomach churns because you know what comes next. The music fades, the guests leer, and your new husband, a man twice your age who smells like old cheese, takes your hand. You probably wouldn't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and local time. Let's see how far this nightmare travels. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge up the stairs, heart pounding like a war drum, as the crowd below cheers for what they're about to witness. Because yes folks, privacy wasn't a thing. Your wedding night isn't just yours, it's a public spectacle, a proof of purchase ritual. The bedding ceremony wasn't some cute tucking-in tradition. It was a full-blown humiliation parade. Servants would strip you down to your shift, think potato sack cheek, while drunken uncles made bets on how long your groom would last. Historians still argue whether these rituals were about community bonding or just medieval reality TV. Here's a mainstream fact to ruin your day. Consummation wasn't optional. Church law declared marriage invalid until the deed was done, which meant even if you sobbed, even if you fought, technically your husband was doing God's work. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some brides sewed tiny bags of animal blood into their sleeves to fake virginity, because the alternative, a bloodless sheet, could get you returned to your father like defective goods. And if you think that's bad, wait till you hear about the midwives who'd, well, let's save that horror for section 5. The door creaks shut behind you, or almost shuts, because let's be real, at least 3 relatives are peeking through the crack. The bedding ceremony isn't over yet. In fact, the worst part is just beginning. You're not just expected to endure your wedding night, you're expected to perform it, like some grotesque theater where the audience heckles if you don't bleed on cue. Here's the brutal truth. Virginity tests weren't just about the sheet. Oh no, some communities required witnesses, actual human beings standing at the foot of the bed like perverted referees, ready to confirm that yes, the marriage was now official. Imagine trying to, focus with your new mother-in-law nodding approvingly in the corner. Historians still argue whether this was meant to prevent fraud, like grooms claiming they'd done the deed when they hadn't, or just another way to remind women their bodies were community property. Now for a mainstream fact that'll make you clutch your blankets tighter. In many regions, a bride's family could demand proof of consummation the morning after. That's right, the stained bedsheet wasn't just a weird tradition, it was a legal document. Fail to produce it and your groom could annul the marriage on the spot, leaving you ruined. But here's a quirky twist. Some clever brides bribed the maids to swap the sheets, using chicken blood or even red wine. One 14th century French satire even mentions a bride who pricked her finger like a fairy tale heroine just to get the damn stain over with. And speaking of stains, ever wonder why medieval art is full of unicorns? Those mythical beasts were symbols of purity, often depicted resting their heads in virgins' laps. Cute, right? Wrong. It was basically propaganda. A not so subtle reminder that a woman's worth evaporated the second she stopped being untouched. But here's the kicker. Historians recently uncovered texts suggesting some medieval women laughed at the whole concept, calling unicorns horny nonsense, rebels even then. As the last of the witnesses finally shuffle out, though you swear you still hear giggling outside the door, you're left alone with your new husband for the first time. And that's when the real dread sets in, because while the public humiliation was horrific, what came next was a private nightmare. Medieval marital rights weren't just expectations, they were legally enforceable obligations, and resistance wasn't just frowned upon, it was punishable. Let's get the uncomfortable mainstream fact out of the way first. Under medieval canon law, a wife's refusal to perform her conjugal duty was grounds for annulment, or worse. Church courts actually heard cases where men complained their wives were rebellious in bed, and if a woman persistently said no, her husband could legally withhold food, confine her to the house, or even in some regions, administer moderate correction. A chilling euphemism that makes you realize why so many medieval marriage manuals included recipes for healing bruises. But here's the darkly comedic twist. All this obsession with control led to some truly absurd legal loopholes. In 14th century England, a woman could technically refuse sex if her husband had leprosy, but only after the disease had progressed to the point where his nose was visibly falling off. Earlier stages, tough luck. Historians still argue whether these exceptions were acts of compassion or just men worrying about defective goods. Now for the quirky tidbit that proves truth is stranger than fiction. Some medieval sex experts claimed a woman could get pregnant from a bath if she'd recently been, shall we say, exposed to male company. This led to panic about communal baths and even cases where women blamed pregnancy on haunted washrooms. Spoiler, the courts weren't buying it. And here's where it gets truly bizarre. Medical texts of the era insisted women couldn't conceive unless they enjoyed the act, a fact that forced many women to fake pleasure just to avoid being accused of witchcraft for infertility. Talk about a no-win situation. The candle gutters as your husband reaches for you, his breath reeking of ale and onions, because medieval dental hygiene was its own horror show. But you can't recoil, can't flinch, because the law isn't on your side. In fact, the concept of marital rape wouldn't exist for centuries. Tonight isn't about love or even lust. It's about possession, a transaction sealed in sweat and fear. Let's start with the mainstream fact that'll make your skin crawl under medieval English common law. A husband couldn't be prosecuted for raping his wife because marriage constituted permanent consent. French jurists took it further, arguing a woman's body became her husband's property as surely as the ox belongs to the plowman. Even the church, which theoretically valued consent, taught that wives owed conjugal debt to their husband. Historians still argue whether this was about controlling inheritance or just raw misogyny, but the result was the same. Millions of women trapped in literal legalized rape. Now for the darkly comic twist. Some medieval women found loopholes in the very laws meant to enslave them. Church courts recorded cases of wives successfully arguing their husbands were excessive in their demands. Like the 13th century French woman who won a separation because her knight husband expected sex 4 times a night, even during Lent. Others used holy refusal, claiming religious visions commanded them to abstain. The smartest ones? They weaponized medieval medicine's stupidity, like the bride who fainted every time her husband touched her, citing physician-approved hysterical suffocation of the womb. Here's the quirky tidbit that proves desperation breeds creativity. Archaeologists recently found a 14th century chastity girdle in Germany, except it wasn't the classic metal contraption. This was a leather belt stuffed with stinging nettles, suggesting some women preferred literal pain to their husband's attentions. And the ultimate irony, while the church obsessed over female purity, medieval doctors believed women had to orgasm to conceive, meaning countless men failed at the one duty that actually mattered. No wonder so many medieval fertility charms involved honey, donkey urine and prayers to saints who definitely weren't listening. The morning after arrives like an executioner's axe, and with just as much subtlety, as dawn light creeps through the shutters, the bedroom door bursts open. It's the midwife trailed by your mother-in-law and 3 nosy neighbors, all here to inspect the evidence. Your body may ache, but the real violation is only beginning as rough hands yank back the bed sheets in search of the only thing that matters: blood. Here's the mainstream fact that twists the knife. Midwives weren't just medical practitioners, they were virginity detectives. In many regions, these women held legal authority to physically examine brides and testify in court about their intactness. Some even carried virginity kits with silver probes, supposedly less likely to rupture a hymen than iron. How thoughtful. Historians still argue whether midwives sympathized with brides or actively enforced this oppression, but records show some charged extra for discreet inspections when families needed lies documented. Now for the macabre comedy. When nature didn't provide sufficient proof, resourceful midwives employed theatrical solutions. One 15th century Italian manual recommends squeezing a dove's bladder filled with goat blood at the crucial moment. Medieval special effects at their most grim. Others swore by alum solutions to tighten tissues or vinegar-soaked sponges to mimic bleeding. The real kicker: these tricks often appeared in midwifery guides right beside legitimate medical advice, like how to deliver breech baby. Quirky tidbit alert. Archaeologists recently found a 13th century midwife's revenge in Spain, a skeleton buried with her tools, and a husband's skull crushed by what appears to be her own mortar. Coincidence? Maybe, but given that midwives knew everyone's secrets, it's amazing more men didn't trip onto their own daggers. And here's the ultimate irony. While the church demanded blood as proof of virtue, medieval medicine taught that menstruation proved a woman was not pregnant, meaning the same substance that saved brides on their wedding nights could doom them later if it didn't stop. No wonder some women prayed to Saint Wilgefortis, the bearded virgin saint who allegedly grew facial hair to escape marriage. Desperate times, desperate devotions. The midwife's verdict hangs in the air like the stench of tallow candles. Approved for now. But as the crowd disperses with knowing smirks, you're left with the grim reality that this was only the first night of a lifetime of performance. Across Europe, medieval brides perfected the art of covert resistance, turning their wedding chambers into battlegrounds of passive aggression and botanical warfare. Let's start with the mainstream fact that proves necessity mother's invention. Apothecary records show a booming trade in anti-amorous herbs like chasteberry, vitex, pennyroyal, and dodder seeds, all allegedly capable of killing male desire or preventing pregnancy. Wealthy women even commissioned silver pessaries, early diaphragms from Jewish physicians, while peasant brides relied on sponges soaked in vinegar or lemon juice. Historians still argue whether these methods worked or just gave women psychological control, but their popularity speaks volumes. Now for the darkly hilarious part. Some brides weaponized medieval misogyny itself. Since doctors believed female pleasure was necessary for conception, countless women perfected the art of theatrical disinterest, lying motionless like frigid statues to avoid pregnancy. One 14th century Italian groom complained his bride might as well have been a salted cod in bed, while French court records mention wives who recited psalms aloud during sex to cool passions. Quirky tidbit alert: archaeologists recently found a bride's survival kit in a German convent, containing fake blood pellets, a dried mandrake root, medieval Xanax, and a note reading "better a nun's veil than a mother's shroud." The kicker: it was hidden inside a hollowed-out prayer book titled "The Virtues of Obedient Wives." And here's the ultimate irony. While the church condemned contraception, the same medieval herb gardens that grew abortifacients also supplied monasteries with hops for beer, meaning monks likely drank the same compounds that sinful women used to control their bodies. God's work indeed. The church's teachings on marital duty echo through the stone corridors of your new home, a relentless drumbeat of guilt and obligation. Priests preached that denying your husband was a sin equal to heresy, yet even they squirmed when confronted with the brutal reality of what they'd sanctioned. Because when theology met the marriage bed, the contradictions piled up faster than soiled wedding linens. Here's the mainstream fact that reveals the hypocrisy. While church doctrine insisted sex was solely for procreation, medieval confessional manuals list shockingly specific questions. Priests were told to ask couples, "Did you do it dog style? Did your wife touch herself afterward?" Actual 13th century examples. Historians still argue whether this was about policing pleasure or just clerics living vicariously, but the result was a system where women couldn't say no, but also couldn't appear to enjoy it too much. Now for the dark comedy. Some priests clearly regretted opening this Pandora's box. One frustrated bishop's ledger from 1382 complains about a parishioner who demanded to know if it was sinful to do the deed while his wife wore a relic of Saint Agnes, patron of chastity. Naturally, the marginal note reads, "God help us all." Quirky tidbit alert: archaeologists found a 12th century sin calculator in a French monastery, a rotating parchment wheel that supposedly tallied penance durations for various bedroom acts. The kicker: it lists husband too enthusiastic as requiring longer repentance than wife weeping during. Priorities, people. And here's the ultimate irony. While the church obsessed over marital sex, medieval medicine taught that breast milk was just processed semen, meaning every nursing mother was, by their logic, essentially feeding babies sex fluids. No wonder some mystics claimed visions of the Virgin Mary lactating holy milk to spiritually bypass this unfortunate theory. Royal wedding nights took the horror to operatic new heights, because when you're a princess, your suffering isn't just personal, it's political theatre. Imagine being 15-year-old Margaret of Austria paraded to the bedchamber in 1497, before hundreds of courtiers, her child bridegroom, the future King of Spain, visibly trembling under the weight of dynastic expectation. The consummation of royal marriages wasn't just witnessed, it was documented by ambassadors who sent play-by-play accounts to rival court. Here's the mainstream fact that'll make your jaw drop. When King Charles VI of France consummated his marriage, physicians actually stood by with smelling salts in case the teenage king fainted from exertion. He did. The Duke of Burgundy's 1430 wedding contract specified that the marriage wouldn't be considered valid until the bride could produce blood-stained sheets and witnesses heard the cries of completion. Historians still argue whether this was about ensuring heirs or humiliating rival families. but royal newlyweds paid the price either way. Now for the darkly comic twist, some royals fought back with malicious compliance. When King Louis XIII was forced to consummate his marriage at 14, he reportedly shouted play-by-play commentary to the waiting courtiers outside. "I'm mounting my wife now." His mother, the infamous Medici queen, later wrote that he'd clearly done this to make the business so ridiculous no one would believe it real. Quirky tidbit alert. Archaeologists recently discovered that Elizabeth of York, Henry VII's queen, had her wedding bed outfitted with extra curtains, not for modesty but to conceal the fact she and Henry slept in separate beds until their coronation. The ultimate royal fake-out. And here's the ultimate irony. While commoners suffered private horrors, royal women's wedding nights could literally start wars, like when a French princess's apparent lack of virginity in 1314 sparked the Tour de Nesle affair, leading to executions and invasions. Because nothing says romance like geopolitical catastrophe. The bed curtains finally close, but the real nightmare is only beginning. Because medieval medicine had some thoughts about female pleasure, and none of them were good. According to the era's top physicians, women's bodies were basically defective male forms, with their reproductive organs just inverted penises. Yes, really. This led to the spectacularly wrong conclusion that female orgasms were optional, and worse, that women who enjoyed sex were probably demon-possessed. Let's start with the mainstream fact that explains so much suffering. The dominant medical text for 1400 years, Galen's on Semen, claimed women only released weak seed during pleasure, meaning conception could technically happen without it. This became the get-out-of-foreplay-free card for generations of medieval husbands. Historians still argue whether this belief stemmed from ignorance or willful misogyny, but the damage was done. Countless women spent lifetimes never knowing pleasure was even possible. Now for the dark comedy. Some medieval sex experts insisted women could enjoy sex, but only if they had a wandering womb, hysteria that needed to be coaxed back into place. This led to doctors prescribing, let's just say, very specific massage techniques. One 12th century nun's medical text actually includes illustrations of midwives using oiled cucumbers as physical therapy for hysterical paroxysms. The notes specify they should be cool, not excited. Make of that what you will. Quirky tidbit alert. Archaeologists recently found a 15th century pleasure belt in Venice, except it wasn't for women. This leather contraption with tiny bells was meant to help husbands know when they were performing adequately, because nothing sets the mood like jingle bells at the climax. And here's the ultimate irony. While the church condemned female pleasure, medieval midwives secretly passed down knowledge of the clitoris, called the little mouse in some texts. The same women who enforced virginity tests by day were likely teaching brides about their own anatomy by candlelight. The original feminist conspiracy. The sun rises on your second day as a wife, and with it comes the crushing realization that last night wasn't a one-time ordeal, but the beginning of a relentless obligation. Because in medieval Europe, a husband could demand his conjugal rights whenever he pleased, and refusal wasn't just disobedience, it was legal grounds for divorce, or worse. Here's the mainstream fact that chills the blood. Ecclesiastical courts granted thousands of annulments between 1200 to 1500 for non-consummation, with the burden of proof falling entirely on the woman. In England, the laws of Canute actually specified that a wife who refused sex could be fined, and if she held out for 3 years, her husband could abandon her and keep her dowry. Historians still argue whether this was about ensuring heirs or sheer control, but the message was clear: your body wasn't yours. Now for the absurd legal theater this created. Some women went to outrageous lengths to prove consummation when it hadn't occurred. The 14th century decretals of Gregory IX describe a case where a bride's friends testified they'd heard bed creaking, conveniently ignoring that the couple had staged the sounds with a squeaky trunk. Other wives bribed doctors to falsely attest to their defloration, while one crafty French woman even convinced a scribe to backdate a pregnancy. Quirky tidbit alert. Archaeologists recently uncovered a divorce chest in a German monastery, a collection of objects women used to fake marital compliance. The content: a vial of rabbit blood for sheets, a hollowed-out egg filled with vinegar, contraceptive douche, and most bizarrely, a carved wooden phallus, labeled for when he's away. But the law still asks. And here's the ultimate irony. While men could annul marriages over unconsummation, church law also said excessive lust was sinful, meaning husbands had to thread the needle between proving virility and avoiding damnation. No wonder so many medieval fertility charms invoked St. Thomas Aquinas, patron saint of awkward compromises. The tapestries lining your chamber tell cheerful stories of courtly love, But the real story is in the frayed threads and suspicious stain. Medieval art pretended marriage was all flowers and poetry, while carefully erasing the trauma underneath. Because when you couldn't scream in real life, you screamed in symbolism. Here's the mainstream fact that rewrites art history. Those idyllic wedding scenes in illuminated manuscripts often hid brutal subtexts. The famous January page from the Trésor shows a feast, but look closer. The bride's blue gown, color of virginity, is being pulled toward the bed by two men while she turns away. Even the dog at her feet symbolizes marital duty. Historians still argue whether artists included these details as protest or just documentation, but the patterns are undeniable. Now for the dark comedy of medieval censorship. When scribes illustrated sex manuals for newlyweds, they often got creative with metaphor. One 15th century German manuscript shows a couple playing chess on their wedding night, with the pieces arranged in very suggestive positions. Another depicts a unicorn purifying a bride's lap, while the groom watches from the bushes. Subtlety was clearly not their strong suit. Quirky tidbit alert. Restorers at the Louvre recently found hidden sketches under a romantic wedding tapestry, including a marginal doodle of the bride kicking her groom in the groin, captioned, "God's Justice." Some artist was definitely risking excommunication for that one. And here's the ultimate irony. While noble women posed for idealized wedding portraits, their jewelry often carried covert messages. Archaeologists found a 14th century ring inscribed, "Je suis ici malgré moi," I am here against my will, worn turned inward so only the wearer would know. The medieval equivalent of a middle finger in gemstone form. The death of a husband should have been a tragedy, but for many medieval women, it smelled suspiciously like freedom. Widowhood was the ultimate loophole, the one time a woman could own property, run businesses, and even refuse to remarry without being labeled a heretic. No wonder some wives reportedly prayed for their husband's early demise with unseemly enthusiasm. Here's the mainstream fact that'll make you cheer. Widows in many medieval cities had more legal rights than wives. The London Borough Customals let widows keep 1/3 of their husband's estate, hence the term widows' thirds, and unlike wives they couldn't be forced to testify against themselves in court. Some, like Italian widow Alessandra Strozzi, even ran powerful merchant empires, all while politely ignoring marriage proposals. Historians still argue whether this relative freedom was meant to protect women or just stop them from becoming burdens on the state. Now for the deliciously dark humor. Widows weaponized their status with glee. One 14th century French widow's will left her entire fortune to her lapdog instead of her greedy sons, specifying the dog got the featherbed where my husband never slept. English court records mention a widow who sent her late husband's armor to be melted down into cooking pots, the ultimate medieval mic drop. Quirky tidbit alert. Archaeologists recently uncovered a mass grave of medieval widows in Germany, all buried with their wedding rings broken in half. But here's the kicker. Forensic analysis showed they'd been filed down years before death, suggesting these women had been symbolically divorcing their husbands, long before the grave did it for them. And here's the ultimate irony. While the church pressured widows to enter convents to protect their virtue, many nunneries became de facto widow retirement communities where women brewed ale, wrote poetry, and according to one bishop's furious letter, giggled over memories of marital disobedience during Vespers. Who says you can't have it all? Peasant weddings lacked the gilded horror of royal ceremonies. But don't mistake that for mercy. When you're a farmer's daughter in 14th century England, your wedding night might involve fewer witnesses, but the stakes are just as high. After all, virginity was still the only currency you had, and your family's survival might depend on those stained sheets. Here's the mainstream fact that shatters romantic illusions. In many rural communities, newlyweds had to display their bedsheets to the entire village the morning after, not on some ornate balcony, but literally hanging from their thatched roof like a grotesque flag. The Yorkshire Domesday customs even required the groom's mother to verify the bloodstains before the bride could receive her morning gift, usually a cow or extra plot of land. Historians still argue whether this was about community accountability or just rural gossip culture, but either way, privacy wasn't an option. Now for the darkly pragmatic twist. Peasant women often had more agency in choosing partners, precisely because their families couldn't afford to be picky. Court records from medieval Germany show farm girls successfully suing parents who tried to force marriages, with one arguing her chosen beau was strong enough to lift a sack of turnips, which is more than can be said for father's pick. Practical romance at its finest. Quirky tidbit alert. Archaeologists digging at a medieval Scottish farmstead found a wedding night survival kit buried under the hearth, containing a sheep's bladder for fake blood, a hazel twig, symbolic fertility charm, and most puzzling, a dried herring. The leading theory was the medieval equivalent of a post-coital snack, priorities. And here's the ultimate irony: while nobles obsessed over dynastic purity, peasant communities often turned a blind eye to premarital sex, as long as you married before the baby came. Some villages even had leap year traditions where women could propose, and couples could test drive the marriage first. Turns out survival trumps morality when the winter grain's running low. Not every medieval woman played the marriage game. Some took one look at the rules and burned the rulebook. Across Europe, a quiet rebellion unfolded as women fled to convents, anchorholds, and even forests rather than face the wedding bed. And the church, ironically, became their unlikely ally, because while it demanded wifely submission, it also worshipped virgin saints who'd rather die than marry. Here's the mainstream fact that'll make you want to cheer. By the 13th century, up to 15% of noble women were avoiding marriage entirely by entering convents. And not all were pious. Many convents basically functioned as elite boarding schools where women could study, write, and, as one bishop complained, gossip over wine about the husbands they'd escaped. Historians still argue whether this was genuine devotion or strategic rebellion, but letters from abbesses like Hildegard of Bingen prove some women saw convents as liberation. Now for the dark comedy of sainthood. The church's own virgin martyr legends backfired spectacularly. Stories like Saint Agnes, who grew hair to cover her nakedness when forced into a brothel, or Saint Wilgefortis, who sprouted a beard to repel her groom, became how-to guides for resistance. Records show some brides-to-be prayed for facial hair on their wedding eves, and one Venetian case even describes a would-be groom annulling the match because his fiancée's chin grew suspiciously mossy. Quirky tidbit alert: archaeologists recently uncovered an anchorhold hermit cell in York with 2 skeletons, a woman and her lapdog buried with a plaque reading "Here lies one who chose God over man, and never regretted it." Forensic evidence suggests she'd been sneaking in wine and roast chicken the whole time, living her best life. And here's the ultimate irony: while the church pushed women toward marriage, it also created the one socially acceptable escape route. When a 14th century French heiress was forced to marry, she reportedly walked down the aisle chanting psalms, then took a vow of chastity with her husband's blessing the next day. Checkmate. Centuries later, the echoes of medieval wedding nights still haunt modern marriages, from the white dress symbolizing purity, a Victorian reinvention of the blood-stained sheet, to the father giving away the bride, a direct descendant of property transfer. The more we peel back the layers of tradition, the clearer it becomes. What we call romance is often just repackaged control. Here's the mainstream fact that connects past to present. The medieval proof of virginity obsession evolved into 19th century medical virginity exams, which were still practiced in some Western hospitals until the 1970s. Even today, 23 countries legally require virginity testing. Historians still argue whether these are holdovers from medieval canon law or universal misogyny, but the through line is undeniable. Now for the dark humor of modern rebranding. Many traditions we consider romantic have horrifying origins. The wedding bouquet, originally herbs to mask the stench of unwashed bodies post-consummation. The honeymoon, derived from the Norse practice of kidnapping brides and hiding until her family stopped searching, with a month's supply of hydromel, hence honeymoon. Even the tiered cake mimics medieval fertility symbols of stacked wheat. Quirky tidbit alert: a 2022 study found that 68% of wedding traditions labeled time-honored were actually invented after 1850, often by marketers. The most ironic: the diamond engagement ring popularized by a 1947 De Beers campaign, while medieval brides considered rubies the true love stone because they didn't crack under pressure. And here's the ultimate twist: some medieval women's resistance tactics are now celebrated as feminine. The Cherchez la Femme movement in France recently revived the 15th century widows' revolt, where women wore red under their mourning veils, a secret medieval code for "I'm finally free." As the last embers of tonight's history lesson fade, remember this: the past isn't just a foreign country, it's the foundation under our feet. Those medieval brides who faked virginity with animal blood, who prayed for beards, who turned widowhood into power, they were survivors, and in small ways, their quiet rebellions shaped the freedoms we often take for granted today. Picture them now, not as victims, but as strategists. The peasant girl slipping fertility herbs into her husband's ale, the noble woman commissioning art, that mocked her marriage, the widow running her late husband's business better than he ever did. Their stories whisper through time, reminding us that even in the darkest ages, light found cracks to seep through. So, as you drift off tonight, let the hum of the fan become the rustle of medieval tapestries. Imagine the clever women who came before, spinning their own endings in the margins of history books. And know this: every tradition we question, every expectation we reject, adds another stitch to the tapestry of change. The past may be set in stone, but the future, that's still ours to write. Sweet dreams.